Good afternoon. You can hear my voice. Stop talking. I was trying to think of something else clever. I was going to say clap your hands, but I was like, let's not do that. So I am Kim Crowder. Thank you all for being here at, what time is it? 3:30 in the afternoon on a Friday. I so appreciate that. When they told me how big the room was, I was like, really? Okay, let's do this. So, my presentation, of course, is about formulating an inclusive marketing communication strategy. That sounds super academic, but what we're going to really do is just talk about how to communicate with people, right? How to have a relationship with someone who may be a little different than you, how to get to know a population that's different maybe from the one that you grew up in. So we're going to keep it sweet, and we're going to keep it light. That means you can laugh, and you can smile, and you can shake your head, because on a Friday at 3:30, we all need that boost of, right, energy. The more you give, the more you get back, just so you know. And that comes from me being a performer and a singer. I have about 16 years of experience in marketing communications, from working with Fortune 500 companies, to doing social media and being featured in Mashable, if you know what that is, but also working for the Indianapolis Public Library. I currently am now a new entrepreneur. So I'm a consultant, and I'm a founder and CEO. Big words, right? I also print my own paper, so it's not that fancy. So let's get into this, right? Let's have some fun. Let's get into this. At the end, you'll have room to have time for questions. So by all means, please do that. I'll have my contact information up here as well. So feel free to reach out to me after this, and we will get started. Also, one last thing, I uploaded the handouts for this after the time period, so you can find it on the website, but you will not find it on the app. So I thought I'd say that. All right, let's get going. So, a little bit about me. I think I told you all of that kind of stuff. What I did mention is that I've worked with Oprah and her team a couple times. So that I know, right? That was really nice. I could just put it on my resume forever. And I've done presentations like this and webinars for American Libraries Association, for Info People. I've done some for the Indiana State Library, Ohio State Libraries. So I get it. Y'all are my people. I'm not a librarian, but y'all are my people. So as we do this, my anticipation is that this feels like it needs to feel for your industry, right? That's the point. So I won't speak about things that you can't use. Hopefully you can walk away and say, tomorrow I can do this. That's the point. So if you want to find me, here are all the ways you can do so. I'll show this again at the end, so you don't have to screenshot it. You can now if you'd like. But this is how you get a hold of me. And if you're interested in any tips and tricks through the newsletter, you see how to find me and get that as well. All right, so here's what we're going to talk about. We are going to talk about evaluating your library's current marketing and communications programs or strategies to make sure that they are indeed inclusive. We're going to talk about looking at tools such as social media, PR, blogs, that sort of thing, to say, hey, am I being inclusive across the board here? I'm going to take this out. And then also, we'll identify 3 areas of growth that you can immediately take a look at and say, how do I grow here with your own strategy? And you can apply the principles learned. And then we'll look at creating content for audiences. What does that actually look like in real life, not in fiction? And, we'll look at exactly how other libraries are doing this, other organizations as well. And then we'll talk about how to avoid some mistakes. It happens. What do you do when that happens? Depending on how long we have at the end, we'll talk about possibilities there about what you can do to kind of curtail if something didn't go quite right. So here's the deal. All are welcome, right, at Library Systems. That's the point, that's the goal. You probably, I'm sure you all have a commitment to inclusiveness. I assume that's very well seen on your website. Because the goal is that people always know that if you need to point back to something, you can go there. And let's talk about what diversity is. I'm just going to skim over. I always like to start with a few terms, just to make sure we're all at the same level, base point, point of information. So the condition of having or being composed of differing elements, variety, especially the inclusion of different types of people, such as people of different races or cultures, in a group or organization. That sounds about right, right? Everybody thought that? Yeah. Let's talk about racial equity. And so people often use the term diversity and inclusion, full stop. But equity is probably the one we should be paying most attention to. And the reason that that is the case is because we don't all have the same starting points, right? And so when we think about what equity is as defined by the Center for Racial Inclusion, as an outcome, we achieve racial equity when race no longer determines one's socioeconomic outcomes, when everyone has what they need to thrive, no matter where they live. As a process, we apply racial equity when those most impacted by structural racial inequity are meaningfully involved in the creation and implementation of the institutional policies and practices that impact their lives. What does that mean? Listen to people. That's exactly what that means. That means don't try to make decisions about things you don't know about. And it's okay not to know. Be okay with not knowing. And then how are you including those voices that do know into your decision making? That's what this really is saying. So what is inclusion? The active state of including or being included within a group or structure. That's a simple one. What is cultural sensitivity? And this one is extremely important to me because you get into what's called nuances within cultures. These are the things that people can't necessarily teach you, right? But it's the same way that as a black person, when I walk in the room and I see another black person, you give them the eye and you're like, hey girl, I see you. It's just the things you almost can't, this lady shaking her head, I'm sure, yeah, she has that, you just can't quite quantify it, but there's something to it. And those are the things that make real connections. Anybody watch This Is Us?
Yes.
Right? I have never quite seen a television show get it like that show gets it. The episode where Malik takes, so I'm talking to some people, they know this, Malik takes Deja on a tour to see Philadelphia, and that whole episode and the way that the parents interacted with each other, we look at how they have a blind actor on the show, as far as, with a child and an adult. All of that stuff is rare, but you look at the nuances of what the conversation is around that, of what you see. That is what connects with people. That is what marketing is. So, cultural sensitivity, it means being aware and accepting of the differences that exist among people with different cultural backgrounds. So being culturally sensitive enables a person to approach interactions with people from different cultures in a respectful manner. It also means both in the workplace and interpersonal interactions. The way that you do that is you increase your level of contact with people that are different than you on a regular basis. It's fine to talk about marketing and what that looks like at work, but the way you get really good at it is you do it outside of work. So figuring out how to make those connections beyond where you have to is what grows you as a person, it's what grows your understanding, it's what grows your connection. So, why is diversity, equity, and inclusion important to library marketing? We have different reasons around that. For one, the easiest one is we serve everybody. For a lot of us, taxpayers pay our bills. But even deeper than that, this is what makes America great, right? And if we can't find room in our marketing to celebrate that part of who we are as a culture, we're missing it, completely missing it. I'm going to show you a video right quick of an organization that totally gets it, especially when you talk about inclusion and celebrating another culture. This takes a little longer than I thought it was going to take to pop open, and you all have probably seen this commercial because it has 67 million views. But one more time won't hurt. No! I'm sorry already.
Just like life. All right.
of you had not seen that? Oh my God! Great! First time exposure, I love it. Didn't you connect with this, whether it was your culture or not? Didn't you get chill bumps at some point, whether or not you grew up with this, whether or not you Googled any of this? There was something about that unified celebration of a culture that just feels good, right? That's the power that you have within your library system, is to share that feeling and that emotion and to help raise a level of influence and understanding and exposure to people who are not of those cultures. I think sometimes when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we think this is being done for that particular culture. This is being done for the general population, right? So think about it beyond just, oh, we're doing it just to connect with Latino people, we're doing it just to connect with Black people, LGBTQ. Not necessarily. This is something that's being done for the betterment of the people overall. So, with that in mind, come on, it's slow. Remember, diversity is not monolithic, right? And so as you're thinking about what does diversity mean, there are so many levels and layers to that, and you get to decide what that looks like at your library system. You know better than anyone else who you serve on a regular basis. That looks a little different from place to place, but think about that. Really have a brainstorming session with your team about who all of these audiences are, or who they could or should be. So think about that, have fun with it. And the most important part is to remember that we all have a level of bias, we all have blind spots, and the sooner that we can say, yes, that's me, the sooner you open the door to understand that you may need to be having conversations outside of your group, right? If your marketing team, if the people you deal with on a regular basis only look like you, then your conversations aren't big enough. They just aren't. And this happens whether you're a minority or not, right? I naturally connect with Black women because I just happen to be one. But as I do my work, I know that that's bigger than just me. So let's look at how to address DEI in marketing and communications. So the goal should always be to put patrons first. Talk openly internally. Have those conversations, have those hard, tough, uncomfortable conversations, lean into them. You don't have to be confrontational about it, but you do need to have them, right? So sweeping things under the rug, pretending like things aren't happening, not the way to go, because not only do you not get the best out of your marketing and communications, but you also offend the person or the people who you don't speak up for. Also, be intentional, so commit to being inclusive. Commit. So what does that mean? That means be uncomfortable sometimes. When being inclusive means maybe that you have to sacrifice a little bit of yourself, be willing to do that. So for those of you who work at library systems or work in the branches, or for those of you who don't, that may mean visiting and working in a branch sometimes, so that you get a sense of what that general population looks like. It may mean trading off or going to an event at another branch. Just making sure that you are engrossing yourself and kind of getting what I like to call getting your hands dirty, so that you get a sense of what's happening in the world outside of you. Also, find training. You can do that online. Info people often, I think if I'm not mistaken, they offer webinars for free. If there's something happening in your community where you can go and learn about another culture, about another group, think about doing that. One of the things I did when I was at the Indianapolis Public Library is I was the only person of color on my staff for a long time. So I made us, and not just for them, but we went to a training around diversity, equity, and inclusion every year. So we chose a different population to learn about, and we focused on that. So think about that. And then lastly, ask for help. By all means, make friends with organizations who are doing this work already, so that when you are doing something and you're not quite sure whether the language you're using is right or the imagery is quite right, then you can pick up the phone and call, or look for those people who are already in your library system who are doing this work, who feel passionately about it, and have those conversations on a regular basis. So, let's talk about the landscape of public libraries and what that looks like demographically. So when I was at the Indianapolis Public Library, and this is back in 2017, 143 employees of color out of 617 total. Bononos, right? And that's typical, right? If we're honest in libraries. I read a quote from Roxanne Gay. She was at a conference speaking, and she looked around the room. She said, boy, there are a lot of white folks here. And so that's just the case, right? That's okay. Sometimes, maybe not really 100%, but that's just what it is. And so if that's what it is, that means that there is specific work that needs to be done in order to expand, right? Can we all agree on that? And that what that doesn't mean is that anybody is a good or bad person because they haven't done the work prior. That's not what that means. It just means learning and growing. So if I'm not mistaken, within the library, and somebody can correct me if I'm right, it's about 77% white women. Is that right? Somewhere there? Sounds about right. But it's about right in there. So you just get a landscape of what that's like. Meaning, think about it. Think about what that looks like. And that's, again, that Mars and Venus thing, mostly women. So we're talking about perspectives and what that looks like. We're just creating some background work here. Diverse leadership is necessary because if that does not exist, women are 20% less likely than straight men to win endorsement for their ideas. LGBTQs, 21%. People of color most affected at 24%. Why does this matter in marketing? You don't know how many people come up to me after something like this and go, hey, I say everything you just said, but nobody listens to me. And so with that in mind, be the person who listens. If you have the power to listen, dig down and figure out and make sure that you're the one who's listening. Because I hear that all the time. They're like, what I'm saying is not new. I'd like to think it is, but it's not always. But the challenge is that people are not getting support. So, what is a marketing strategy? It is a plan of action designed to promote and sell a product or service. Whether you like it or not, libraries are businesses, right? You have a product to sell. Maybe people aren't spending money on it, but indeed you're promoting something, you want people to use it. So it's a product, it's a service. And so here's some truths about marketing and inclusion. Millennials are the most diverse generation to date. Three quarters of some survey participants would like to see brands better represent diversity in ads. And 70% of participants say they're more likely to buy from a brand that takes a stand on race-related issues. And so this is not only about race, right? We know that. People basically want to see themselves in what you do. They want to see themselves represented in however you decide you're going to connect with your population on a regular basis. And that doesn't just mean putting a picture of a person on a printed piece, right? That means having conversations with people, finding out what's important, and then basically mirroring that back to people. That's all we do. As a marketer, you're just mirroring back what's important to people. What they've already told you makes sense for them. What they've already told you need, you're just mirroring it back and saying, hey, I have what you need, and I have it in a way that makes you feel accepted. So, is your library's marketing plan and communication strategy inclusive? And in that handout, if you take a look at it, there are a few questions in there that help you answer that question. For those of y'all who weren't here, the handout is on the website. It's on the PLA website, so you can download it from there. You don't have to think about that right now. Take it back with you and really think through that. But you also see, like, if you're 4 out of 7, you might be inclusive, right? If you say 2, and some of the questions are things like, over the last few months, have you evaluated who your audience is? Baseline. And that sounds like, of course I would do that, but, we don't, right? You're doing work, you're putting out output, you're busy, you're overrun with things to do, and so maybe you haven't had time to think about it. This is a great stopping point to do so. So here are some barriers to inclusion in marketing: staffing, lack of diversity and varying point of views, interests, or understanding. We talked about that a little bit. Resources, right? I know libraries don't have a ton of money. Training's unavailable. Images are lacking because you have to buy those, right? Or you have to pay somebody to take those images. Not having partnerships where you can work with people out in the community. Access to research. Library materials haven't been invested in. And what I mean by that is I've seen library systems where they don't have a lot of books specifically about certain groups, or that are related to certain special interests. No one's really taking the time to purchase those. And then the support, not having advocates in higher positions who truly get it. I said that one, so y'all didn't have to. Because that does happen, and that is a major barrier point, right? If you don't have that support, it makes it really tough. Also, fear, concerns about how the new content and focus might resonate with customers, right? Will people find it offensive? Will people get upset? We had somebody where we had posted something about the library had opened a Center for Black Literature and Culture. It was on the homepage, and somebody said, "Can you please take down that Black History Month? I'm tired of looking at it." People are that crazy. And so the answer is no. However, it does happen. You may very well receive pushback. Anybody do drag queen story time? How many hells hit the fan? Right? Right. So it will happen. When you involve yourself in diversity, equity, and inclusion, some people will be uncomfortable. Be okay with that, but make sure that before it happens, you have your messaging down pat. You have your messaging ready for how it's going to look in social media, in PR, on your website, for how it's going to look in print, so that when the time comes, you are only just handing them what you already have. That's just a little extra tip. Opportunities. Specifically hire diverse staff and listen to them. Or maybe, it's not so much about saying I'm only going to hire this person, but it is making sure that you are putting information about your job posts, especially if you're a hiring manager, in places where people can find it who are of diverse populations, right? Which means you probably can't put it out the way you've been putting it out. Ding, 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 ding. Something to think about. Resources. Find local partners who can help. Look for online trainings. There's some that's free. There's great articles. A podcast that's great is Code Switch. Anybody listen to Code Switch? Excellent. But there are a ton. That's just one good one. There are a ton that you can listen to, just learn more about these kind of topics. The audience, use email to reach out to your community about perceptions to your library system. Don't be afraid to get some hard truths back. Because the more you know, we can get real disillusioned on our side of things, and somebody on the other side. I remember I was in college, and a teacher looked around the room, and she was like, "This is a diverse class." And the three of us who were of color looked at each other like, "Is she serious?" So it's just coming from different points, right? So be okay with hearing the hard truth come back at you, because all that means is that you have room to grow. Also, educate yourself tremendously and show the benefits of that education over and over. So when you think about wanting to win people from the top down, the more you can provide some numbers, the more you can provide some background around why this is working. You all know this. People are like, awesome, fine. Show me how this is helping us, people come to programming. Show us how this is helping move books. That's what you need to do in order to continuously talk, the number side with people. And then do it afraid. Be prepared to stand by your decisions. We kind of talked about that, having your messaging ready. So, what are the main tools that your library uses to tell stories? Can anybody shout out a few?
Press releases.
Press releases.
Video.
Instagram, Facebook, social media.
Word of mouth.
Word of mouth. That is a strong one, isn't it? Email marketing, website. So we'll go through some of these and talk about what that looks like on, in real world as we run through some of what you all said. We won't do them all, but we'll do some of them. So, creating messaging for target audiences. Think about consumer behavior and interests, education and socioeconomic dynamics. Look at your website activities and usage patterns as well if you have access to that. I know some of you do, some of you don't. Especially if you can chart it around a campaign that you're doing. So for instance, if you created a page specifically around a certain program that's coming up, a special collection that's coming up, and as you do the campaign work, how can you make sure that people are going back to those pages? And you get a sense of whether or not it's working. Also, Look at your messaging for program and services. We talked about that. Social media engagements is always a great one. And that's more than just likes. Are people commenting? Are people sharing? And then lastly, always have a goal in mind. Always have a goal in mind for what you want to get to. There's no reason for you to do all this strategy and have no idea about where you want to go, because then you don't know if it's working or not. So, and goals don't have to be complicated. You can have like 2 or 3 of them. But make sure you always are leaning back on those. So we've already done that one. So as you create content for your audiences, here's some things to think about. Pop culture and local events are great like basis. It doesn't always have to be, look, it's Black History Month. You don't always have to do that. It can just be tied to something that's happening outside of your system. All that is just another way that you're connecting with the community, especially when we're talking about social media, because remember, the point is to have a dialogue. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about having a dialogue. And all you are doing, basically you want 85%, and this sounds crazy, to not be about you. And then that last percentage, that's your sale. But that sale doesn't happen every day, right? You take your time with it, and then boom, you sell it. Oh, by the way, we're having an event. But in the meantime, you're talking about what's going on in the city. You're talking about a great book list. You're talking about a question maybe someone had, or what are you currently reading, asking people those kind of questions. Think about holidays and times of the year where you can really boost some things, some conversation around, National Women's History Month, LGBTQIA+ month. When are those times of the year that you can really boost the conversation? But to be very clear, the conversation needs to be had 365, so don't quarantine it down to 28 days. I'm not salty about that. And also use visual imagery as well. So use hashtags as well. Do your research. Find out what hashtags are being used on a regular basis. We know we need diverse books, but that is not the only one that is available to you. Kind of do your homework around that. And don't be afraid to hashtag like crazy, especially on Instagram. Especially on Instagram. They say the average was, and this was a few years ago, was that 11 hashtags were like optimal. That's crazy. But it's true. So I'm going to show you an example, done wrong, done right. On a few of these, this is print in particular. So if you look at the one, and it's on you all's left. You see, and so this looks really weird because these are side by side. But I will tell you, those sweet little animals look disarming, don't they? Right? You wouldn't think one thing of that. You're like, oh my God, look at those cute little animals. Look at the elephant dancing. However, when I showed up at the library, this was something they had been using for years. And I stopped and said, oh, that's offensive, right? When you talk about African dance, we're not talking about animals, we're talking about children. So you see the other side of that and what that looks like as far as imagery. But that is nuances, and what that takes is someone who is your gatekeeper, who understands well enough to stop. And so as you think about your strategy, make sure you have someone who is your gatekeeper, who says no, who's unafraid to raise their hand and say, this doesn't quite feel right. Because being quiet does not get the job done. All right, so for this next one, this first one was what the designer came back to us first with. And I just felt like it was very disingenuous, right? You kind of have this guy who is maybe doesn't look like anybody necessarily, with a bracelet on, and saying, oh yeah, that feels like it represents the LGBTQIA population. And I was like, well no, let's remove the face, and let's make this about books. And so the next iteration we got back was that picture, but you notice the colors are not the colors of the LGBTQ flag, nor are they in the right color. And so that's where we ended up. But that's why we talk about making sure you have someone who has an eye that's turned on to be able to see that. I also ran this by a couple of people that I knew really cared about these causes and said, when we use this language, all pronouns welcome, does that feel right? Does that feel fair? And so again, making sure you're running that by people when necessary. And your diverse content you can have on Facebook. This works for any social media, but intentionally bringing in diverse culture. So you look at the first one, it's about Ramadan. And when you use kids' materials, like the animals, people tend to be a little less, I'm trying to make sure the conflict is not as strong, because there's something about the sweetness of children that disarms people. So think about that. How do you bring in that piece with children's books as well? We had a partnership at that time with Immigrant Welcome Center talking about that on a regular basis and just sharing that. Whether or not the people on our social media would use it, that wasn't the point. The point was to say that we're doing this and this is important to us. And the last one, it's just having a great book list, particularly around Latin American, around fiction and nonfiction from Latin American YA books. So think about that. How can you find that on a regular basis? And these did not happen a certain time of the year. This happens all days of the year. Does anybody do ads? Anybody do pay for play with social media? And when you're looking at those audiences, really dig in to make sure that you're finding the audiences that make sense for whatever you're promoting, but doing it so that it shows up in places that maybe people who normally use your Facebook pages or your social media wouldn't find it. It's again like where you post your jobs. Some of it you may have to stretch a little bit on that, but play with that and take a look at who's liking it. As you open that up, look through that a little bit. Who's opening it up? Who is creating that dialogue with you? Who's engaging in that? Think about it. Don't just put it out there and not look at it again. And having diverse content on Twitter. So if we're talking about, we used to have a citizenship, a naturalization event, and we posted about it. And you can see no one's faces, right? Because we want to be respectful, but it's just saying, hey, this happens, and it's beautiful. Also, we did not have anyone on our staff who regularly posted in another language. If you can find that, it is golden. It is absolutely golden. We could not find someone who could do that on a regular basis, but for cities, like Houston, where there's a large population of Spanish speakers, if you can figure out how to do something like that, do it, please. We did, though, partner with organizations who could do that work, so at least we could retweet that, and we could put that information back out, even though we couldn't always answer the questions in the way they need to. The great part now is that on Facebook it has a translator, but you and I both know, much to be desired. And then think about blog content. How many of you all have blogs at your libraries? Quite a few. So as you're doing your blog content, think about this. It's just all the way to think about inclusion. And I say this, as much as you can plan ahead, the better. Because if you can plan ahead, then you can take a step back and look at what you're really doing. When you're doing it in the last minute, it doesn't really provide room for reflection. It doesn't provide room for you to be objective. You're kind of just reacting. So the more that you can plan ahead and really get a sense of what information you're putting out, the better. Again, more blog content. This is around service dogs, right? And this is for kids. So again, as you think about what diversity and inclusion is, it's not monolithic. There are tons of ways to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Here's a really beautiful social media campaign. The one, lastly, she talks about being able to navigate the world independently because she's blind, right? So think about how do you create room for these conversations without making it, so like, hey, we're preaching to you. But again, it's just a conversation. When others acknowledge my disability, having someone themselves speak about their own situation. And that's the beautiful part about video. If you have access to your phone, you can do videos. I know that scares people, but 82% of 82% of viewed content on the internet in 2020 is estimated to be videos. 82%. So what does that mean? If you're not doing videos, people are not seeing you. So I would say if you were going to walk away from here with anything new that you wanted to use on social media, I would say videos is a great place to start. The classes are cheap, tons of information online to do that, and you can play around with diversity and inclusion that way by having folks from marginalized populations speak directly to the camera, tell their stories from their point of view. I want to talk about something we did at the Library Center for, it was the Center for Black Literature and Culture. I mentioned that a little bit. As you're looking at special collections and you're starting to build out your campaigns for something like that from start to finish, remember messaging is everything. And we were very clear about, you all can read that on your own, about what the message was. We didn't hide that. We were very clear that this is very much so about the celebration of those with African roots, period. But we also said that this was for everyone. And actually, at the end I'll show you a video where something is happening in the center and you see that there was more than just the typical who you would think group that came and really was interested in what was happening. So, you want to identify 3 areas of growth and apply these techniques that you've learned. So what do you think about when you think about 3 areas of growth? That can look many different ways. You can choose what that looks like for your library system, but I can bet you off the top of your head, you can think about 3 populations that you are not connecting with on a regular basis and you're wondering why. Have you asked them why? Have you asked them why they don't connect with you all? You might want to start there. The best place to really start building those ideas is by connecting with those folks and then listening to them to turn that into the campaigns that you want to move forward. And you've seen libraries do a really great job of this. You've seen people out in the world do a really great job of this, what we saw with Google. That's because people in the room looked like the population they were trying to speak to and they listened to them. So figure out how to do that in your library system. And also think about, as you do that, what tools you want to use specifically that make sense. Because every tool doesn't work for every population, right? For instance, if you have your social media, you know that that's probably mostly English. And sometimes that means that the population you're trying to reach out to, word of mouth works best, and so does print. So really think about, as you're messaging things, where that needs to be messaged. Does that really make sense at every single branch? Or does that work for a branch in a certain region, or branches in a certain region? And again, take just 3. Start with 3. Reevaluate those every quarter. Do that for about a year. See where you are from start to finish. And decide what those goals are and decide if what you're looking at as far as your target audience, as far as the numbers or whatever you decide you want to get to, is that, are you doing what you plan to do? And if not, as you move into those 3 months, what are the tweaks that you need to make? And being okay with making those tweaks. Also, you can abort a mission if you need to. If it's not working, you can let it go and pivot. But I do recommend that you don't do that. Take 6 months, see what works, see what doesn't work. Give some time, because in 2 weeks, you're not gonna all of a sudden build this audience that you have ignored for the last 5 years, right? So remember that in doing this work. Also, as you are coming up with campaigns, you've spoken to people, and now you're coming up with these ideas, do that in an inclusive environment. That includes folks of different point of views, and I always, again, listen to them. And so that means that you may have to talk to people who are outside of your normal group of folks who do this work on a regular basis, outside of the person who does your social media on a regular basis, outside of the person who writes your marketing content. You may very well have to invite some people. Focus groups are fine. Think about that. Does it make sense for you to invite people from out in the community and have those conversations? And also, get training. If you can find it, get it. And these are like, you could take this today, and just off of this slide alone, you could make some major changes. Don't get frustrated in doing the work if it doesn't work the first, second, third, fourth time. Be willing to press through and figure out what the tweaks are that need to be made. And then, let's say you fumble, right? You do something that doesn't quite go right. I see fear in so many eyes right now. But it does happen. You can make a mistake and it does happen. And what do? You admit your mistakes immediately and you take responsibility. No buts allowed, but you don't, no excuses. You apologize quickly and sincerely. And then you offer an email address for more questions. That's a big one. So you have a point person on staff where you say, hey, you've got more questions. Here's, where we messed up. This is our point person who has that messaging and answer those questions. This is just good crisis PR. You can even do a video with a recognizable friendly staff member's face as well. So they have that same person maybe who's answering the questions. If they don't come off as friendly and warm, don't use them. Don't use them. If they're better on email, some people have a face for email. And be okay with that, because the message needs to feel as genuine and warm as possible. If that message needs to come out in a different language, think about that. Think about that. Also, where you message when you fumble is important. I talked about some of that. Don't put it on social media when you know full damn well that the people you offended are never going to see your social media. Think about that. Think about it. So, one of the things that I like to mention is that I offer a lot of free content. So if you want to go on my website, this particular podcast is one that I did about how we created a marketing campaign for the Center for Black Literature and Culture. I talk about it from start to finish. You can find that on the website. That talks about how you can find that, and there's quite a few talking about advocacy and social media as well. So you can go on there. There's free resources. And then just always remember that we serve all. At the end of the day, that's the overarching statement. That's what is most important. So as much as you can put your desires aside, as much as you can put your bias or maybe your blind spots aside, the better it is for the larger population. If you want to find me, there's how you can find me again, by all means. And now's the time for questions.